Today is March 11th, 2026, day 12 of an active war between the United States, Israel, and Iran, and the threat on the table just crossed a line nobody expected. On March 5th, a senior Iranian military official told the semi-official ISNA news agency something that stopped analysts worldwide in their tracks. Iran would strike Israel's Dimona nuclear facility, the site widely believed to house Israel's entire undeclared nuclear weapons program, if the US and Israel pursue regime change in Tehran. Not a military base, not a Gulf installation. Dimona, the most classified, most protected, and most consequential target in the entire region. The exact words cited by ISNA were precise and deliberate. Tehran's final effective missiles will target the Dimona nuclear reactor and all regional energy infrastructure. Then came the line that no diplomat in the region will forget. This is a scenario we have already prepared for. That is not improvised rhetoric. That is a pre-built contingency being announced publicly. The Shimon Peres Negev Nuclear Research Center sits in the desert roughly 85 kilometers south of Jerusalem, and just 25 kilometers from the Jordanian border. Israel officially describes it as a research facility. But every major intelligence agency on Earth operates under a very different assumption, and has done so for decades without exception. The Federation of American Scientists estimates Israel holds approximately 90 nuclear warheads. Israel has never signed the Non-Proliferation Treaty, so the IAEA has no authority to inspect the site. What we actually know about Dimona came not from governments, but from a technician named Mordecai Vanunu, who worked there and leaked photographs to the British press in 1986. What those photographs revealed was an underground nuclear weapons infrastructure that shocked international observers and permanently changed how the world understood Israeli military capability. In my view, the reason Iran named Dimona specifically, and not a military headquarters or an airbase, is calculated and worth unpacking carefully before anything else. This threat was issued 6 days ago. As of today, day 12, regime change remains the stated objective of Operation Epic Fury, and Iran has not walked the warning back. Netanyahu and Trump both said publicly that the goal is to create the conditions for the Iranian people to replace the regime. Senior Israeli officials told the Jerusalem Post the U.S. intends to go all the way. That framing is not a military objective with a defined endpoint. It is an existential condition, and Iran's leadership is responding to it with exactly that level of stakes. The Arms Control Association published an assessment this week with a finding that reframes the entire threat. A strike on Dimona would risk significant radiological fallout across surrounding civilian populations. Jordan sits 25 kilometers from the facility. Egypt is not far beyond that. A radiological release does not stop at a border. It moves with wind patterns across the entire region simultaneously. That is what separates the Dimona threat from every previous Iranian escalation in this conflict. It's not just about Israel. The consequences would be regional and impossible to contain after the fact. Drop a comment right now. Do you think this war stops before Iran is forced to decide whether to act on that threat? That question is now driving every back-channel conversation in the region. If this kind of sourced, verified analysis is what you come here for, hit like now. It helps this reach more people at exactly the moment it matters most. Next, we look at whether Iran's missiles can actually reach Dimona, which systems are in play, what Israeli air defense can and cannot stop, and why the answer is more complicated than either side admits. Here is the question. Every defense analyst is asking right now, and nobody is answering cleanly on camera. Can Iran actually hit Dimona? The short answer, according to Wyon News, citing multiple defense experts this week, is that a successful strike on Dimona is considered extremely unlikely, but not impossible. And that gap between extremely unlikely and impossible is exactly where the most dangerous strategic calculations are being made right now on all sides. Let's start with range, because the geography here matters more than anything else when analyzing whether this threat is real or rhetorical. Dimona sits in the southern Negev desert, roughly 1,000 kilometers from Iran's western missile launch positions along the Zagros mountain range. Iran's K-Bar-Shekan, its most frequently deployed solid-fuel ballistic missile in this conflict, has a confirmed range of approximately 1,450 kilometers, more than enough to cover that distance. So, the range question has a clear answer. Yes, Iran's missiles can physically reach Dimona from inside Iranian territory. That is not in dispute among analysts covering this conflict. What is in dispute, and what makes this strategically fascinating, is whether those missiles can get through what's waiting for them above the Negev desert specifically. Dimona is not defended the way a typical Israeli military base is defended. It is defended the way nothing else in Israel is defended, with a dedicated priority-layered shield built specifically for this site. According to Wyon News and defense analysts, Dimona is protected by a dedicated combination of Arrow 2, Arrow 3, and David's sling systems, positioned specifically to cover that facility above all others. Arrow 3 intercepts ballistic missiles outside the Earth's atmosphere entirely, in space, before they begin their descent toward a target, giving defenders maximum engagement time and distance. In April 2021, a Syrian surface-to-air missile, not even an offensive ballistic missile, landed near Dimona despite Israeli interception efforts. That incident is documented by The Week and multiple other outlets. That 2021 near-miss matters because a wayward Syrian missile reaching Dimona's vicinity is a very different problem than a coordinated Iranian salvo using maneuvering warheads in 2026. The Khaybar Sheikhan carries a maneuverable re-entry vehicle. Its warhead adjusts trajectory in the terminal phase, the precise moment when aero systems are computing their final intercept geometry. Iran used both the Khaybar Sheikhan and the Fatah 1 in the October 2024 strike on Israel. Missile debris was reported near Dimona during that attack, according to documented reports from that period. In my view, the critical variable is not whether Iran can reach Dimona. It clearly can. The real question is whether it can fire enough simultaneously to overwhelm the dedicated intercept systems there. Iran's documented tactic across this conflict has been saturation. Wave after wave of missiles designed to exhaust interceptor stockpiles before the next wave arrives with the actual targeting payload. Each Arrow 3 interceptor costs approximately $3 million. Each Khaybar Sheikhan costs far less at scale. That economic asymmetry in a sustained saturation campaign is deliberate Iranian doctrine. The Arms Control Association stated this week that a successful strike, while unlikely, could compromise the complex and have a devastating regional impact, with real radiological risk to surrounding populations. Every Arrow interceptor assigned to Dimona's defense is one fewer available for Tel Aviv or Haifa. That allocation tension is itself a strategic outcome Iran is deliberately engineering with this threat. Stay with me, because next we get into what a successful or even partial strike on Dimona would actually mean for the region, and why the radiological math is more alarming than the military math in this scenario. Most people assume a missile hitting a nuclear facility means a nuclear explosion. That assumption is wrong, and the reality is, in some ways, far more alarming. A ballistic missile striking Dimona's reactor structure would not detonate like an atomic bomb. The fuel inside is not enriched to weapons grade. Nuclear engineers are clear on this distinction. What it would do is breach the containment dome, releasing decades of accumulated radioactive material into the atmosphere as a wind-driven contamination cloud over the region. The Arms Control Association published a detailed study on exactly this scenario, using the U.S. Department of Defense's own hazard prediction and assessment capability modeling tool applied specifically to Dimona. They're finding at 150 megawatts of operating power, the radioactive plume moves northwest over the city of Dimona itself, then toward Beersheba, then toward Israel's heavily populated coastal plain. That coastal plain is home to approximately 4 million people, according to the Arms Control Association's published modeling. Not worst-case speculation, but DoD tool outputs applied to this specific facility. At 70 megawatts, a conservative estimate. The same study projects excess cancer cases exceeding 600 in the near population, rising above 1,000 at the 150 megawatt operating level. 6 decades of continuous operation means the fission product inventory inside Dimona makes it one of the most radiologically significant sites in the entire region. Now here is the dimension that virtually no current coverage is addressing: what happens beyond Israel's borders, because that is where the regional stakes become impossible to ignore. Jordan sits 25 kilometers from the facility. Egypt's border is 75 kilometers away. Prevailing winds across the Negev move from west to east, directly toward Jordanian territory, for significant portions of the year. The Al Habtoor Research Center, an independent think tank based in Cairo, modeled an Iranian strike on Dimona in a study published in June 2025, months before the current conflict began. They're finding Jordan's border regions and agricultural zones in the Jordan Valley face direct contamination risk, potentially requiring the evacuation of tens of thousands of people from the area. The Sinai Peninsula could face moderate to severe contamination, with approximately 25,000 to 50,000 residents in the direct risk zone, depending on wind patterns at time of impact. Dr. Bilal Ansuli, head of Lebanon's Atomic Energy Commission, told Al Modin amid the current conflict that a Dimona hit would change everything, naming Jordan, Syria, and Lebanon as the most exposed countries. He added that Lebanon has activated its early warning system across 20 military monitoring sites, currently checking every 3 hours, a detail that shows how seriously regional governments are treating this threat. The Suez Canal sits approximately 300 kilometers from Dimona. Contamination reaching northern Sinai would immediately raise questions about a waterway handling roughly 12% of all global maritime trade. In my view, this is the layer of the Dimona threat that makes it unlike any previous Iranian escalation in this conflict. Consequences that extend directly to countries that have no part in this war. Jordan, Egypt, Lebanon, none of them chose this conflict, None of them can opt out of the wind patterns that would carry a radiological plume across their territory if this threshold is crossed. The Al-Habtoor study drew a direct comparison to Chernobyl, whose exclusion zone covers 1,600 square miles with initial evacuation across a 30-kilometer radius. Dimona is 25 kilometers from Jordan's border. Stay with me, because next we look at why the countries with the most to lose from a Dimona strike are not the ones with the most influence over whether it actually happens. Here's the detail that almost no one in Western coverage is saying out loud. Jordan, the country closest to Dimona, has no nuclear shelters. The kingdom sits 25 kilometers from the facility. Its border communities, its agricultural zones, the Jordan Valley, all fall within the contamination corridor identified by multiple independent studies. And yet Amman has no comprehensive national response plan for a radiological incident originating from Israeli territory. No mass evacuation protocol, no public shelter system, no decontamination infrastructure. Egypt's position is equally uncomfortable. President Sisi publicly stated that Iran made a miscalculation in targeting Arab Gulf states. Cairo spent weeks before the war trying to broker a diplomatic exit. But Egypt also borders Dimona at 75 kilometers, close enough that the Al-Habtoor study flagged Sinai residents as directly at risk in a contamination event. Neither government chose this conflict. Neither has a seat at the table where decisions about escalation are made. Both face consequences they cannot prevent and cannot fully prepare for. The diplomatic contradiction at the center of this war is one that the Dimona threat forces into the open. Washington says this is not a regime change war. Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth told CNN directly, this is not a so-called regime change war. Yet President Trump publicly addressed the Iranian people and encouraged them to replace their government. Iran's military official cited that exact ambiguity when issuing the Dimona threat. Regime change is the stated condition. If the condition is disputed by one party, the threat remains permanently unresolved. Iran's missile capacity has been significantly degraded. CENTCOM and IDF estimates put the reduction in ballistic missile fire at 86 to 90% since the opening days of Operation Epic Fury. That means what Iran has left is a fraction of its original arsenal. The phrase final effective missiles from the March 5 statement takes on a specific weight in that context. It is not the language of a military that believes it is winning. It is the language of one calculating what it can still reach and what would hurt most with what remains. The IAEA convened an emergency session on March 2nd, called by Russia, to address the conflict. The agency confirmed no evidence of radiation leaks from damaged Iranian nuclear sites so far. Dimona is not subject to IAEA inspection. No international body has the authority to assess its current structural condition, monitor integrity under wartime stress, or issue early warning if something changes. That gap, a facility 25 kilometers from Jordan under no international oversight, sitting inside an active war, is something no diplomatic statement from any party has directly addressed. What happens next depends on whether the regime change question gets resolved through military outcome, negotiated exit, or Iranian political collapse before Iran decides it has nothing left to preserve. Jordanians, Egyptians, Lebanese, and millions of people along the eastern Mediterranean coast are waiting for an answer to a question they were never asked and cannot vote on. If this analysis matters to you, share this video with someone who should be paying attention to what this conflict is actually putting at risk.